This is working. This is working. Hey guys, this is Utkarsh on this side, and I'm gonna be taking a session for decoding frontend. And in this session, we are going to learn about the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. For an overview, this is what we are going to make. We would have a basic landing page, and like this is a very basic structure that most people start out with. This one is made using solely flexbox. It is one of the positioning techniques in CSS. You can take a look at it. And the second part, uh, the second part would be a dashboard, and that dashboard is made using grid. That is another technique that we are going to discuss. And the last one is going to be a API call that we are going to make using JavaScript. And like let me get something set up for you so I can show you these things. And like for this session, like if you guys are very new, we would use the live reload. That's like an extension on VS Code. You can use it to like see changes as they are made directly to your web page. And this is what I was talking about. Like on the API side, we are basically going to use a pre-built API that basically gives us all the songs created by an artist, and you can also listen to it if you guys want. For example, let's say if I search Eminem here, it will give me all the songs made by that guy that's on the API. And this is going to be a basic dashboard. This one would be made using CSS grid. So like before we get started, I would like to give you guys a general overview like about what HTML and CSS exactly are. So like they are basically two languages that work together to create everything that you see on the web, and they are very crucial for it. HTML is basically how you structure your data. It contains your data. It is the raw data that a web page is built on. All the texts that you see, the cards, the list, the buttons, everything that you can see on this page is HTML. What CSS does is add style to those place elements. For example, let's say like this is a blank canvas to begin with, and this is my basic page. This is my basically boilerplate HTML code. And as you can see, let's say if I put anything here, it's coming on here and it's quite plain. There is like no colors, nothing, just plain text. So like this is what HTML is, and we use HTML to put data on your web page, and we use CSS to make it look like this. We add colors, we add transitions, we add effects, and everything that makes it look pretty. Like resources, like a lot of people would say that HTML and CSS are programming languages, but let's say if you want to get technical about it, labeling them as such is not quite accurate, because they are only concerned with presenting information. They are not used for programming any logic. JavaScript is where you program your logic. That's the programming language which is used at front end. So like that does not mean that HTML and CSS are not that important compared to JavaScript, because like we can still achieve a lot with just using vanilla HTML and CSS. So like starting out with basic HTML elements, right? So here's a landing page. So like there's some very basic HTML elements that I'm gonna show you. Like this first one is like a header element. This, as you know, the name suggests, it's used for headings, right? Then there's a P tag that translates to basically the paragraph element. You basically put a bunch of text in here. For example, let's say some lorem text, right? It's basically a paragraph. And let's say you have links on your web pages that basically link you to other pages. Those things come under the anchor tag. These are what exactly take you like to other pages, and they only work if you have an href attribute on top of them. And they can be anything, like it can be something that's present on your PC, like a root directory to a web page, or it can be a global address that takes you somewhere else on the internet. For example, let's say if I put here google.com, I think it should take me there. I actually need to put the complete format of it. Wait, give me a second. Like it needs a protocol, and it should take me there. See, like it needs an absolute path or something in your root directory that it is pointing to. We are going to come to that on the later stage of the project. And like we like a lot of times we also encounter lists. They can be ordered, they can be unordered, and those things are also quite important, because like when you're writing HTML, it needs to be semantically correct. And it is important because the Google search engine, the web crawlers, put emphasis on how you write the HTML. So it is really important that we use the correct tags for the correct set of things. Like this tag is like a container tag for your list. It specifies an unordered list, and inside that it's going to have some children's called list items, and it can contain anything. It's basically you could say a paragraph text. And like as you can see, like there's a small dot here, right, that basically like marks it as a list element. Like 3 more hello there's basically like this is your unordered list. And if I want an ordered list, it's basically the OL tag, and those dots get replaced by numbers basically. And I think you guys have seen a lot of images on web pages, right? So like there's a image tag for that. Just like the href, it takes a source. Like for the anchor tag, it's href, and for the image tag, it's source. Like you can basically put any image that you have on your root folder basically. For example, let's say I have some icons. I can put some icons here. Let's see. Wait. And since the icon is white, I can't really show you guys anything, but let's say see, like this is basically an image icon that I put. Since it was white, I was not able to show you guys this icon, but I changed the background so you guys can see it. So it basically takes a source attribute and it puts that image on your web page basically. And there are some more tags, like for example, I use the div here, right? Like there are two very important tags when it comes to HTML, div and span, because like each element that you see in this web page, for example the body tag or the h1 tag or the p tag or the a tag, each tag has a specific meaning associated with it. They are used for specific purpose, unlike the div and span tag. The div and span tags are generic tags, they do not have any meaning, so we can assign them using attributes, but they are generalists basically. They don't have any styles associated with it by default, and we can make them look like however we want. It's comparatively easier to style in some cases. And like there are different types of HTML elements. I think it's probably time that you guys should get familiar with the web developer tools. Like if you click on this icon, basically pick an element from the page. I'm using Mozilla Firefox, by the way. So like it basically shows which element you are selecting, and if you guys take a look here, if this is my element that I'm selecting, h1 tag, there's a box, like it's showing it as a box. If you guys can see here, there's a margin around it, there's some border, it's 0, so there's no border actually. There's some padding which is also 0, and then there's your content. It's like this is what the box model is. Like everything that you see on the web page is basically a rectangular box. Everything is a box, even circles are boxes. They are just inside rectangles or squares depending on the height and width. So like this is a very crucial part when it comes to HTML, because like there's only one shape, and that's a square or a rectangle depending on the dimensions you have. Now coming on to like some basics of CSS, like, there are multiple ways to like add CSS to a file. Like we can either use external linking, right? We can link CSS file by using the link attribute. Like this goes into the header tag. For example, like this link and CSS, and basically I need to specify the CSS file that I'm using. It's like api.css or dashboard.css or style.css. It can be anything. You can name it anything you want. It just should end with .css. This is basically using an external file and you are linking it to the HTML element. This is the preferred way to do it in most of the cases, because your HTML file is completely separate from the CSS and you can modify it independently, and it promotes modularity. It's easier to maintain. There is another way to use CSS, it's basically using a style tag inside the head, and you can basically write CSS just like you write it in the external file. For example, let's say if I had a class, I can just use this class and write my styles here, or I can use inline CSS that is applied directly to the element. It works on a single element. You need to apply it for each element that you have on the web page. It works in the same way, but it is comparatively harder to use, and honestly you should stay away from it because it's very hard to maintain, and it's not a good practice to use inline CSS, because if let's say you want to change something in the future, it's going to be a lot of headache to do it. You would have to visit every element on your HTML document and change it, and it's going to be really hectic. It's like, I have used this thing here, right? Some people might be wondering what exactly it is, like what's dot class one. So like they these are ways to specifically identify a specific element on the HTML document. So for example, let's say if this HTML document had a class attribute which had a value equal to class 1. So if I apply any properties inside it, it's going to apply to all elements with the class 1. So as you can see, h1 has the class 1, and that property background color black is applied only to that specific element. For example, let's say if I change it to something else, let's say pink, the background color is now pink, and it is applied only to that specific element. And there is something like this, something else like this called an ID. Those start with hash, and in principle class and ID for use case are very similar. The only difference is classes are not necessarily unique. They can be multiple classes, and those classes can be used across multiple elements. But semantically, if you are using an ID, right, then only a single element on a web page should have that ID. For example, let's say if this p tag had an ID, I'm gonna use the ID attribute now, right, and let's call it paragraph, and I'll change it this one to paragraph. So like semantically, I'm not allowed to use this paragraph ID anywhere else on this web page. I might use it somewhere else on another web page, but I'm not allowed to use it on this specific page again for some other element. And it works literally the same way as the class. I can apply any property I want. I'm using background color to show you guys this because it is easier to visualize. I'm gonna apply another color, changes the background color. There are like a lot of properties that you guys can play with. Like I can show you some of them. For example, let's say if I type font, there are like a lot of properties regarding font. For example, the size, the family, the weight. The weight is basically how bold or light it is going to be. Font style is italics, display variant, kerning, it's like related to anti-aliasing, a lot of properties. And similarly, there are a lot of properties related to the background. You can set a background color, you can set a background image, you can clip the background, you can set a background repeat, like that thing works in tangent with background image. There's a lot of properties. You can, like, if you guys want a reference, you can go to MD and web docs and take a look there if you guys want. That thing should be your go-to resource when it comes to web development. Either it is JavaScript, HTML or CSS. It contains all the informations and standards that are applicable to modern day web development. So like till now, like we have seen some basic HTML elements, we have talked about the box model, we have seen some CSS like CSS classes, right? Selecting elements by applying a specific class or an ID. There are actually a lot more ways you can select an element. Like this one was like just by using the class or ID, right? There's another type of selector in CSS that's basically a type selector. Let's say if I want to apply something to all the list elements, inside my document, I will just type out the HTML tag basically. The list elements are like li tags, right? So li, and let's say background color beige, right? It applies to all of them. And like just to show you guys a bit better because it's a bit clumped up, let's do a margin property, right? 20 pixel, it's going to be applied all around it. And like here's like another example of the box model, because like I applied a margin of 20 pixels, right? You can see it here, a margin, it's demarcated by the yellow color, then a border. I guess I can show you the border. Let's say a border of 1 pixel, or like let's say 10 pixel solid red. So like here's your content, like it's supposed to be like a padding, let's do 30 pixel. So like as you can see, like what exactly do we have here? We have a li element which has a margin around it of 20 pixels. We have a border of 30 pixels, 10 pixels actually, my bad, 10 pixels, and we have padding of around 30 pixels, and then we have the content. So like regarding the box model, you can just think of it as like you have some content, you have some padding around it, then there's border that encapsulates the padding, and then there's margin that encapsulates the border. And like these things come into hand, like you use it when you are like shifting elements around a little bit, or like tidying things up. You have some elements present, you want some space between them, you might use margin, tidy things up, and things like that. Now coming back to CSS selectors, right? We were doing this one. We applied some specific style, some specific properties to all the list elements in it, right? So there are even more ways to select it. It is not limited to that. CSS selectors are something that are quite powerful when it comes to selecting elements. Let's say another way of selecting the list elements is like, let's say I want all the list elements inside the li tag, ol tag. Like this is also a way of selecting it. It basically means if you want to read it, I want like select all the li's inside the ol. This is a descendant combinator. So like if I apply something to this, it's going to be applied to all the elements inside the ol, all the li elements inside the ol, as you can see. And there are some more common ways to select elements. For example, let's say there's a class one, right? And there was another element, let's say h2, and this also had the class of, let's say, class 1, right? Because I said in the beginning that you can use the same class across multiple elements on a web page, right? So like the problem arises that h2 and h1 have the same properties applied to them. What if I want something different? What if I want it to be a bit more specific? What I can do is I can just type h1 here. What this means is basically select h1, all the h1s which have the class 1 applied to it. It's without any spaces. That's what you need to keep in mind. If you put a space in here, it becomes a descendant combinator. That's this one. And what this now means is apply this property to all the class 1 elements inside the h1 tag, which in this case we don't really have any, so we can't see anything on the web page. There are like some more common CSS selectors that you guys should be aware of. That is the root. We are going to come to it how exactly we use it later on. Like there's a root selector, there's all select, it's basically star, right? Basically means select all the elements on the web page. And you can also group selectors together. If let's say you are applying some common styles to multiple classes or IDs, what I can do is dot class 1 comma dot class 2, and let's say if I write any property here, anything, those properties would be applied to class 1 as well as class 2 elements. Now I think it's enough for the basics. Like, it does get a bit boring if you just continue on reading and or listening to someone say some things about it. Let's start to put it into practice. This is the first thing that we are going to be making, right? It's a very simple layout, and while making it we are going to be using flexbox. It's a positioning technique, right? And it's quite powerful. And we are also going to be using some positioning properties like position absolute, relative, sticky. That's another way of positioning element. It is something that was quite used back in like 2005s or something. It is still used today, but for different purpose. So like this is what our landing page for now is going to look like, and let's get started with this. Let's just clear this out. So like I talked about semantic HTML in the beginning, right? Every tag has a meaning to it. So like the first thing when you open a web page is just like, you know, your notebooks. Basically you have a heading, right? Some sort of heading or header. Drawing an analogous from that, we can say your first element, generally you can of course deviate from it, but generally it should be the header. Now the header tag basically tells the browser and the web crawler that this is the header of my website, and the header can contain some headings, or let's say your hero section or your navigation bar or anything that you think belongs to the header. And it is necessary to write it semantically because like if you make a web page or anything, your page would be ranked on the basis of how accessible it is and how semantically correct it is. So the better it is, the higher the score is, and the more chance is that it is going to show up on the search result. So I said we have a nav bar inside the header, right? So let's start with using the nav element. It usually is used like when we want to store some navigation links to other pages like we had here, right? This is a nav bar. There might be some logo in it. There's a navigation link to the dashboard, the API thing, and a placeholder link. It does not do anything. And it can have a button, depends on what you want in the navigation bar, right? But it must have some sort of navigation links or properties. So starting out with this, let's say I will apply the class of navbar to it so that I can select it later on. And like generally you should not specifically rely just on the type of element. Like I told you guys that you can just use this, right? Apply this to all the elements. Like generally, like if you can use a class, because you can use like a lot of times, like you can use the same element multiple times, and like you need to differentiate between them. So like I just call it navbar. You can call it anything you want, it is up to you, right? So let's start. Let's say heading for our logo. We don't really have a logo, we're just going to use a heading for now, right? I will, let's say, call it my logo header, and just like let's put some content inside of it. That's what we have on the page, right? As you can see, it's quite plain. So like when you are writing HTML, like the first thing like you should do, like even before applying CSS, is like get the basic thing set up, get the basic content set up, put in some tags, put in some data, then try to style it using CSS. That's the best way to do it. Don't write CSS beforehand, or like try to do it simultaneously. I mean, you can do it simultaneously, but it's not advisable. Put your content on the page first, then start styling it. And of course, you can break it down into smaller parts. That's what we're doing right now. I'm just working on the header first, the nav bar to be specific. So I will just put the content that I need inside the nav bar, then start applying styles to it. So as I said, like the UL is going to be used here. It's basically another list. People use it a lot in navigation bars. You can also use a div, but general practice is to use a ordered list, right? And in this case I have 3 li tags, right? Let's remove this, we don't need them anymore. Right, so let's say this one is going to be, no, it's going to have an anchor tag, and it's going to be pointing to, let's say, our dashboard.html, right? I have like already a basic project structure set up here. Like we have 3 pages, like index.html is the landing page, dashboard is what we are going to make later. This link is going to move us here, the dashboard.html page, and we have a api.html page. That's where we will make our API call, just as a demonstration of how to use JavaScript. So let's say we have another element here, right? Another anchor tag. It's gonna link to api.html, and the thing with anchor tags is like it links here. What exactly you want to show as a link needs to go between those tags, the anchor tags. For example, it's dashboard here, right? So it comes at a dashboard. As you can see, like if you have visited any government websites that's quite old or something, you would see links like these. These are what hyperlinks are. They take you to places basically on the internet. when we have an API, and let's say for now just this one is not doing anything, so like we can just put a hash here. It basically takes me to the same page again, and just call it link 3, right? So this is what a like navbar is right now, for now at least. And this is the styles that I'm going to be using for the index.html. I've like already imported it, as you can see in the beginning, right? And this is basically a Google Font API, right? You can go on to Google Font, select the font you like, right? And it will basically give you a link. You can import it directly into your CSS and use it like as a replacement of like whatever font you want. So like now starting out to like some basic styling, what are the things, like let's set some things up first. Like it's usually a good practice to have some CSS variables. Now CSS variables is something that I've not discussed before. I'm going to do it right now. Like as the name suggests, like just like any programming language, they store data, and in this case the data is properties. And what are properties? The things, the styles that you want to apply to your HTML elements, right? So in this case, for example, let's say, what do you guys think is the property that we should abstract out into variables? Something I guess we are going to use a lot. For example, let's say the background, right? There's a background, there's like a overlay color of sorts, this light area, a button, for example. It does not make sense to like define these properties again and again, or like define these colors again and again for a specific element, right? So I'm going to be doing that. I'm going to abstract it out into variables, and I will call them later on when I'm going to use them. So like in this case, as like I'm using the root selector too, right? So like the root selector is like, you can think of it as the root of your HTML document and it's basically in a way equivalent to the HTML tag. You can also put things in here if you want, but people use root because HTML can be served through multiple things, right? It not necessarily be the root document always. So like we are basically telling CSS that like, hey, whatever the root document is, apply these properties to that. Let's start out with the background color. Right, the background color is #1E3652, right? And like always make sure it ends with a semicolon, or it won't take it as a property. It will start throwing up errors when you actually viewing the web page. We have, let's say, a secondary color. It's basically white #FFFFF. It's the hex value. We have a tertiary color, that's #6CE7E0, and something we are gonna use very later on is a hover color, like the color that the button is when we hover on top of it. It's going to use a function. There are functions in CSS like these. They take in parameters and give you something back, just like normal functions in like programming languages. But these are predefined. You cannot create a new function. You can create new variables, but you cannot create a new function in CSS. They come predefined. This is the RGBA function. It basically takes the red, green, blue and the alpha channel value and gives a corresponding color with respect to that. For now, like for the hover, at least we are going to use this combination 48209 238 0.7. 0.7 is basically the alpha channel, the opacity. The opacity 1 is like basically completely visible, it is 100% visible. 0.7 means it's 70% visible in a nutshell. And we want to turn off all the margins to begin with. It sometimes get a bit problematic because, as I said, all the elements except div and span have some basic styles associated with them, right? So we are basically removing them, like all the margins, right? And setting some more properties. For example, box sizing. Initially, we were like working on content box, the thing that you see here, this property, as you can see, box sizing content box. Like the problem with this is, let's say if I say I want my lift element to be 200 pixels wide, it would be 200 pixels wide in the beginning, like the content, this blue thing would be 200 pixels wide, and everything after that will be added to it. So in the end, my element is not exactly 200 pixels, it is a little bit bigger than that, depending upon the padding and border that has been applied to it. So sometimes it gets a bit confusing, so like people started using border box. What it basically does is change the type of box sizing. Now the difference between this is it will calculate the size from the border rather than the content. So like if I say border box and like this width is 200 pixels and I add margin or I add padding, this content would shrink such that the end size of my element is at max 200 pixels. It will never exceed that in any case. So like it helps put things in perspective, because like if I say something is 200 pixels, it will stay 200 pixels. Now like for the whole document, I'm specifying the font, right? This is something that you will get from Google Fonts. They will tell you the type of font that you want to use, the properties you want to use with this specific font. And this one is basically a fallback. If this does not work, show everything in this thing, sans serif. And this another property called letter spacing. This is just for beautifying and stuff. Like every letter that we have is going to have 1 pixel space. Basically, I can put 10 pixels here. It's increasing the space between the letters, as you can see. For now we are just going to use 1 pixel, and I guess that's it for now. We are going to move on to the body tag, and as you can see, like the body by default has some margin associated with it, 8 pixels to be exact. And you might be wondering why the body is not covering the whole page, because we don't have that much content right now that the body like expands to take up the whole screen. That will come later on as we start putting in more content into it. The body size will increase, the height to be specific. So like we wanted to remove the margin, right? As you can see, there's a margin. You guys, you need to remember that because it is important. Body tag has 8 pixels margin associated with it, and it's probably best that you remove it unless you want it in some specific cases. So like for now, like since I want to remove the margin from the body, I will just do margin 0, right? And let's say I want a padding of 20 pixels, and I will do a overflow X hidden. For now, I will tell you guys later on why I did this specific thing. Now like this is like the basic setup, right? Now coming on to the nav bar. We were styling the nav bar, right? So like this is my logo header inside of it. So logo header, it's, if you guys remember, I basically specified this class earlier on here in logo header. It basically corresponds to this, right? Now I want to basically, let's say, increase the size, right? So there's a font size property for that. Let's say I want the font size to be 32 pixels, and the weight, as I said, like for changing how bold it is, different font weight values. The lower it is, the lighter it is going to be. 900 is a max, or you can just use this keyword bold. It makes it bold. Now coming to the nav element, right? This section, this like the nav element, to be specific. It's like a parent container, right? Inside this, like, there's no nomenclature when it comes to setting font color. There's no property such as font color. What you have is this color property. This is the thing that is responsible for setting the color of an element's text. So right, it's going to be white, so hash FFFF. Now here comes display flex, right? And I will see what exactly happening in a couple of seconds. And let's apply a background color to this. By the way, like, if you have specified any background, like CSS variables, and you want to use it, plug in those values to some property, use the var attribute, right? So like var, and then whatever variable that I want to use this one. So it sets the background to this one. It's similar to this. You're moving towards what we exactly want, bit by bit. So like we were talking about flex, look, display flex. Now this is where the web developer tools come in. If you guys see the nav, you can say it's specified as flex, right? I can just turn it on. You can see this. This is basically the empty space of the container. This is my logo. This is the container of my UL tag, and inside that is my li elements, right? And when I said earlier flexbox is very powerful, I meant it because it allows us to center, like align things very easily compared to how things were like couple of years ago. People used to use tables to make web pages and websites when flex was not there. Now we don't exactly need to do that because it was quite cumbersome. So like in this case, like we have a nav, we have a display flex, and we had another list, right? You can also apply display flex to it. You can see like it moved sideways, right? It moves in a line. So like one thing you need to remember is like flex is best used when the layout is one dimensional, because like it starts out by putting things in one dimension. If it does not fit, it moves it down to another line which is independent of the other one. It gets kind of confusing, so I'm keeping it kind of simple. Flex basically, whenever you use it, puts every element on a single line to begin with, as you can see here. And by the way, like this dots, right, these are basically the tags that we have, like the markers for list item. We needed to remove these things because they don't really have any purpose for us, right? So we can just do list style and none, right? This basically removes it. Then we have some anchor property, the anchor tags. I'm applying some properties on the anchor tag. right? So let's say the color is basically hash FFF, and there are some pseudo elements, pseudo properties, right? For example, these underlines, hash underscore uh, visited. You will come to this later on, because like when you click on it, come back, usually it changes color, it becomes purple, right? And it looks kind of ugly, so we will change that later on. Text decoration none, this basically removes the underline that we wanted to avoid. Now, like, coming to the navbar part, right? We have this, we have this. What we need is a button, right? So there's a element for button. Let's do it like this. Login, right? You can see it's not the perfect shape, but we will modify it later on. And it's kind of stretched out because of the flexbox. So this is your flex container, right? We want to align things inside of it. So for creating nav bars, like, one important thing is margin auto. Like, it basically tells the browser ki, like, hey, give me as much margin you can in a specific direction. That direction must be specified by us, basically. So in this case, there's a UL element, right? I want as much margin as I can get to the left of it. So I will basically do margin left auto. So it basically gives me as much space as it can to the left side, puts everything on the right, and it's kind of taking place to like this right now. We will specify more things later on to make it look better. Now things comes to like the vertical alignment. These things are not vertically aligned. They might be horizontally aligned in some, to a certain extent, but it's not vertically aligned, right? So like, you need to like justify content property, which aligns things horizontally inside a flex container, and there is align items property that aligns things vertically. By default, like, flex container is horizontal, so you could say the main axis is horizontal, the cross axis is vertical. Justify content works along the main axis, and align items works along the cross axis. So let's say I want to align things vertically, I can do center. Align item center, it puts everything vertically centered. And I wanted to justify, like, move them along the horizontal plane, right? So I can use, let's say, the space around property. It did not change a lot because I'm using the margin left, but when the size shrinks, that property will come into effect. And this another thing that I kind of missed out on was like the default styling. As I said earlier, every element has some default styling associated with it, right? So as you can see, this UL tag by default has 16 pixels of margin, right? Not the UL tag, but the LI element. It has a margin associated with it, right? It's kind of towards the right side. It need not be. It's shifted towards the right. So we also need to remove this type of margins. So like, we can come to that part later on. We are like styling things. Let's put gaps between it, right? Like, it's kind of clumped up together. So this was a nav bar, right? There's a gap property that we have that basically puts space between the flex children. Like this is a flex container, everything inside is a flex children, right? So we this is an independent flex children, this is another child, this is another child. We need some gap between, let's say a gap of 2m. So like it puts some gap between it basically. And like we had a button, we need to increase the size. Let's do padding. Let's say a padding of 20 pixels. As you can see the buttons, it increased quite a bit. Let's do 16. And let's do a width of, let's say, 200 pixels. Quite big. 150 pixels should work, right? And let's do a border radius of 12 pixel. Border radius, as you can see, like the border is curved, right? It's kind of circular, but at the same time it's still a rectangle, as you can see by the purple line. So like that's where the box model comes in. Everything is a box on the web page, right? And like adding some styling to this, for example the color. So background color, where I'm going to use this tertiary thing, changes the color. There's appearance property like that works with input elements and buttons. I'm removing this because like there are a lot of default styling shaped with buttons and input forms that are quite hard to deal with. So like it kind of takes care of that. Now increasing the font size of this button, like let's do 20 pixel. Login, right? It's comparatively same. Then like this is kind of like looking like a basic, not exactly the same, but it is taking shape slowly, right? This is supposed to be navbar. We will modify it later on, right? Because like we have one more hour left, right? So let's kind of speed things up a bit. I hope you're understanding what I'm teaching. It's like this is like the hero section, right? It's a very basic hero section. It's a two-layered structure basically. Like in this one I'm still going to use flexbox. Like this thing is this is one child, this is another child. I will show you guys how to do it. And like here comes like my main element. Right, I will call it, let's say I need a wrapper div inside it, which I will call class hero section. Then I would say, I guess, another div. The first div is like basically a wrapper for my placeholder and my image container. And like just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to like copy this part of the text, like so I don't need to type it out. You guys can put anything in here if you want, does not really matter, right? This is supposed to be like the heading of a hero section. This is supposed to be the p tag. It's a paragraph, as I told you guys earlier, right? And then we have another button, right? We have a button which like just says start. And now coming on to this part, right? We have this. definitely does not look the same, right? We are going to modify it. So like the first thing I guess that we can do is like change the font color, right? Inside the body I want everything to be white. Color var secondary. So like starting out with this, let's put in the placeholder. Let's just call it hero text image holder. And like that's for it now, and like I will just use h2 tag, place a placeholder inside of it, right? So like what we have here is this, and now when I apply like the flex box again to this part, basically our it was hero section, right? So dot hero section, then I will apply display flex, right? Right, here I have a hero section, there's a display flex applied to it. Now I need to modify like the max width of my element, right? So like it does not take up all of the space, like unlike this, like what we have here, right? And I think I made a little bit of mistake because I'm getting a p tag here. I think it's not closed. So like this, we have this basic button, it's wrapping onto a new line. So like what we have is hero text container, right? So like for this one I'm going to, let's say, apply a property limiting the maximum width, right, for this. And let's say I will, let's say, first of all, let's say do a font size. A color, let's say I am taking a random color, let's say it's a bit gray, right? Hash C0DEVE. Then it basically grays out the color, right? Now inside the hero section we have this, we need to like decrease the font size of this one, so I need to select the header tag, right? And we also need to like set the max width of it, so like hero text container max width, let's say, of 400 pixel, a padding of 2M, so like move things along, right? And this should technically not be here. And just to fix the color a bit, what exactly is the color here? Inside the body I want the color to be, let's say, var FFF, right? So like as you can see, like this is my flex work as of now. So like the problem that I am seeing right now is the placeholder is below, it's not onto the side. So like this is where the web developer tools come in, and they will tell you like how exactly is your flex container setup. So this is my flex container, and this placeholder is actually out of the flex container, right? So if I look at my HTML that I have written, this is something that has been set up by flex, right? This is flex, but this is outside it, right? So what I can do is put it here, and you will see it will go to the right side. Now for this hero image holder, I will apply some more properties to like make it look like this, and I will also like create a utility class, because I'm going to be using this thing quite a lot. Like this is where the concept of utility classes come in. It's used in Tailwind a lot. It is basically how Tailwind deals with things. You have a predefined class and you just apply it to it. You apply it to different elements, right? And you apply the same properties again over and over without like redefining the rules. You have a common rule set inside a specific class and just apply it to other elements. So like for this one, let's say like this effect, let's say I will call it overlay, right? I need to specify the overlay. So let's call it overlay, right? And what exactly does it have is a background color, RGBA, right? 255, 255, 255, and the alpha channel, that's basically the opacity, 0.05, and a border radius of 20 pixels. Right, I have not applied it to anywhere here, so like there's no point of it at right now, but I will start applying it, right? And we are basically setting this up right now. Then we'll go back to the nav bar, fix it a little bit, make it look just like this, right? So we have a placeholder for now. Now this was a hero section, right? And this contained these two elements, and we basically need some space between it. Like we need a horizontal alignment, so I will do justify content and space between. So it will basically push it all the way around there. Space between, like all the space is basically between these two flex children, right? And align these vertically, so center, right? And the problem that we have right now is again due to default styling. It's a header has some default styling associated with it, and since it has that, there's like a lot of space around it. So what we can do is take h1, and this is like where I'm grouping multiple styles together, and do a margin of 0. So like this basically remove the margin that I had around the heading element, as you can see, right? There's no margin around it anymore. This margin around the p tag, that's again its own default styling, but that's fine. And I guess we can start working on a button a little bit, because it kind of looks ugly. It really does look ugly. So I will, let's say, make another class for, let's say, a blue button like this, right? Let's do this. We let's say call it button blue. I will do a font size of, let's say, 20 pixels, border radius of 20 pixels, padding 0.5 m. It's like one of the ems is like one of the size units you have in css. The default em size is 16 pixels, so 0.5 m means 0.5 times 16 pixel, and it's a bit dynamic in some cases, but like it's a bit too in depth, so I'm kind of glossing over it. You just need to remember that 1m is 16 and that's the default. And let's say I have a background color and it has RGBA. Wait, not background color. I have a border. I need to remove the border. I have a border var of color white border, and it's 1 pixel, it's solid, right? So this is my button one. Let's apply it here. Let's see. So like this is what we have right now. This look comparatively better, and we will apply it again, this utility class, to this one here. Button blue, it's the same. Actually don't need the border. Can remove it. Just need to do border zeros like this. No, this overlay effect here. So now coming to alignment, right, you can see it's not properly aligned. We have this, right, we have this hero section contains this div. Let's do this, right, it's not aligned properly, right, it has no padding and anything, it's just how it is. So let's align it vertically, and for vertical alignment, if I'm using a horizontal flex container, I need to use the align item property. Align item property. So hero section align items center. So it basically puts it here, right? Now in this case we had this hero image holder, right, and there was an overlay effect applied to it, right? I think we made the overlay, yes. So let's go here. This is chaining CSS classes. You can apply multiple CSS classes to a single element. You separate them out with spaces basically, right? And let's also apply it to the nav bar. Inside the nav bar, let's do overlay. Right. So like we have applied those classes. Now what we need to do is basically add the specific properties that we want, right? So let's say, oh, by the way, like I think we forgot to fix this thing. So we had this link, right? Let's call it let's just, it's a UL tag, right? So we will say like UL is also basically a display flex. I think we specified that earlier. Yes, and we need space between it, so a gap of let's say 2m, and we need a font size, let's say, of 24 pixels, right? It's kind of looks similar now to what we have here. The thing we are missing is the overlay. We will add those properties later on when we are working on it, right? Kind of getting things set up here for now. This is a placeholder kind of stretched out. It would be fine, we can fix it later on. Let's actually just not, rather than doing space around, he wrote space between. Let's do justify content center, and then this has basically a gap of 5 ems, right? Actually a bit more. Let's do 20 m. So it's comparatively simpler, comparatively same. So it's kind of close at the same time to the nav bar. As you can see, there's no space between basically. So that's where the margin comes in. We will use the margin on hero section, margin top to be exact, and let's say it's 30 pixels. So it moves it down 30 pixels. It might not be very noticeable because like there's no overlay effect as of now, right? But it is something that we will notice later on. And like we use the anchor tags here, so you can see like the on hovering on top of it, it's basically changing because these are hyperlinks now. Now coming on to the button, right? Let's start styling the button. On hovering the button, like usually you get some sort of indicator ki yeah, the cursor is on top of the button. So to add that part, we need to use the button hover pseudo selector, right? Button, it's hover, it's basically tells what to do when you're hovering on top of an element. That's button. And I will do background color var that we defined earlier, button hover, this one that we specified earlier, right? So when I hover on top of it, you can see it dims, right? But the effect is not smooth. We will add the transition property now to fix that thing. And how can we do that? It's actually quite simple. We basically do button and we do a appearance none, a border. Again, I'm fixing some things, I will remove some properties later on. Transition, what I want to transition takes some parameters, the thing I want to transition, how long, and the transition function. For example, I will transition the background till it's gonna take 300 milliseconds. The function is ease in out. So like when I hover on top of it now, it takes time. It looks comparatively better, honestly. Now coming on to the hero text container, because like the font color is same basically, right? To fix that, we basically apply the color property individually to this one, right? If I apply it here, it will kind of mess it up and apply to all of it. What exactly is it here is the hero section, hero text container, right? And inside that we can do, let's say, a div of text on the paragraph basically. So here we are going to use the descendant combinator, hero section container, and inside that select the P, select the color, set the color to hash, let's say CCCCC. It's the value for basically a gray color. So like this is kind of setup. We will add the overlay later on, right? What we need to do is make some cards now, right? These cards, and then some more text overlay, and this is the footer, right? So like let's get right into it. Let's do another header, right? Let's do h2 some random information, right? On this page it's like this. I think I put it inside the div, right? So this is what it is. So now I am selecting the h2 inside which div, inside main. So inside main I will do h2, I will do text align center. It will basically put it at center. Then I want some margin around it, so let's do margin top 20 ems, 5 ems, and I think I'm selecting something else as well. So like let's specify it a bit more. Let's do class second heading, right? And you can just replace it with this. So now it's only applied to this one. That is where the specificity comes in play. I have some random information. Now I need to create the effect of this card basically, right? So for the card, let's just call it squares for now. I will specify the CSS for this first because it's just a simple shape. It's gonna, let's say, have a height of 275 pixels and a width of 275 pixels and an outline var. It's going to use the tertiary color and 1 pixel solid, right? So it will kind of give us this type of effect, like it's just a simple square. We will add it now here. So let's do it. We have a heading. Beneath the heading we have a div, right? Let's encapsulate this in, let's say, a section tag, because we will use flex on this later on. I will call this class icon container, right? Icon container, and inside that I will have a div, a wrapper div, and this wrapper div will, let's say, have a card, because this can be considered as a card. I'm calling it a card inside a wrapper, and I will do another div, and it will have class of square. So if you see here, I have a simple square right here, right? It's not the same. I will apply more effects to it. I will align it better later on, but this is what we have right now. So let's just copy it a bit more times, couple of more times, so we can get a bit more cards, right? Or actually wait, let's add some more content to it first. I have a square, then below that square, let's say I have a p tag. This is some subtext below the content. And this is a card basically at this point. So now I will just copy it a couple more times. Let's do 4 times. What we have here, like 4 cards, they are vertical, like each comes onto the next line. That's because a div is a block element and it takes up the whole space horizontally. If I put another block element after it, it will always start out on the next line, right? And as you know, like if I want to put it right next to each other, I can just use the flex, and flex is going to be applied to this container called wrapper, right? So let's do dot wrapper display flex, and it will move things side by side. I want to put a gap between them, let's say a gap of 2 ems, right? There's some gap between them, as you can see. I need to align them. I will do justify content center, right? And this some subtext below it, I also need to align it. So let's take a look at our HTML. It's inside the card, there's a p tag. So what we can do is card, inside a card, select all the p tags, text align center. And what this will do is basically align everything center wise. The problem, the difference, we can't see any difference because like it's on a single line, but if I decrease the size it becomes like this. So I will basically specify, let's say, a max width, and I will do a max width of, let's say, 100 pixels. Let's see how wide it is. It's quite small. Let's do 200 pixels. And it is on the left side, right? Now for the card, I'm actually going to use the flex again, but this time I'm going to use it vertically. So like the axes are going to change. The main axis going to be vertical and the cross axis is going to be horizontal. You will see what I mean in a couple of seconds. Flex, display flex, and flex direction. By default it's row. I want to set it up as column. I will do column, right? It becomes column like this. Then I want to center it horizontally, align items center, and it is perfectly centered right below it, as you can see, right? And coming on to the next part, we have this, right? This is basically another section right inside, right below the cards. So this is called a CTA in web design. It's a call to action. It is basically what asks the user to perform an action. I will make a class for it. I will call this CTA wrapper. Then it will contain another section with class, let's say, CTA and overlay. I will fix the overlay later on. And it contains a p tag, right? Call to action. Let's copy it from here for now. And I have a button, says sign up. And for now, like, I guess it's a white button. I will apply a class of, let's say, button white. I will specify this class later on, right? And this in itself is going to be a display flex. We will work on it too, and setting up the basic content right now. Above the CTA wrapper, we need to add this part. This is like a code, so we'll just call it, let's say, code wrapper, right? And inside is basically a section. Let's call it code container, and I will also apply an overlay to it later on, so just put it there. Inside it I have a p tag, right? So rather than typing it out, I will just copy it from here. This is what we have till now. We'll work on it more. Right. We have a p tag, and let's have another p tag for this thing. Right. So this is what we have, and we will start styling this part now. right? So let's take a look at our HTML. It's a quote wrapper. We have a quote container. Then we have a CTA wrapper. We have a CTA overlay, right? So let's start with quote wrapper, right? Uh, let's do the quote wrapper. It will have a display of flex and a justify content of center because I want to align it to center. As you can see, it's at the center, right? Then inside it I have my quote container. I think I wrote it right. Yes, I do have a quote container, and it will have some more properties. Let's say a max width. I think a lot of you might be wondering where I'm like getting all these sizes from, like why I'm using a specific margin value or a specific size value. That's because like I have a design file and I am kind of referencing it, and it basically tells me like what the value is. It's not supposed to be the headache of the front-end developer usually. The design, the one who makes the design gives you all the values, and your job is to implement or like guide them, tell them whether it's possible to implement it or not. It's gonna have a display of flex, and it's, since it's like italic here, right? I was talking about font style in the beginning, right? Font style italic. You can see it's italic now, right? Flex is on this side. I need to change the direction. Flex direction, column, a padding around it of, let's say, 20 pixel, 30 pixel, 20 pixel, 30 pixel. This is my padding, and I want a letter spacing. I want a bit more letter spacing this time, so I will do letter spacing of 2 pixels. Like now I'm coming on to a bit more advanced CSS selector. Like inside this wrapper there's actually two p tags, right? One for this, one for this. I want to select the specific p tag. There's another combinator function for it, right? It's basically dot quote container. It basically means inside the quote container. That's not the important part. The important part is this p nth child, and this takes an arbitrary function. It can be anything. It can be 2 and it will select every second element. It can be 3 and select every third p tag inside the quote container. So right now I just want to select the second element. I will just do p nth child 2. So like this allows me to basically select the second paragraph tag, set it to like 24 pixels, font weight to bolder, margin left to auto. So it's kind of taking shape. We still need to work on the overlay, and we need to work on the call to action, right? And like I use the margin again, I set it up vertically, and I use the margin left to like move it to the rightmost side, set some padding to have some space between the container. You can take a look at the box model of this container if you guys want. This is my quote wrapper, right? Here's like there's no margin around it, but inside this overlay there's all the properties. There's a margin, there's some padding, margin to separate it from the top, margin padding to separate it from the border. It's like coming on to the CTA, the call to action, right? We had CTA wrapper, CTA overlay, and a button white, right? So let's start with CTA wrapper. CTA wrapper, I have a margin top. I have a margin top of 4 ems. I have a font size of 30 pixel. I'm gonna set the display as flex, and I'm gonna do a justify content center, right? Everything is like basically kind of centered right now. Justify content center for the CTA wrapper. If you're wondering why this is not centered, because like I have not applied any properties to it. This whole container is a single child inside the CTA wrapper, and that thing is centered. Now coming on to the CTA, I will apply display flex again, then justify, and then now things will move inside this. As you can see, center, then align items. By default, as you can, like, the reason the buttons are stretching like this most of the time is because it has a default value of stretch. I can change it by doing this, and then it stops stretching all the way basically. And it has a gap between these of 2m and a padding of 2m, right? So like this is kind of like a basic layout setup. What we need to do is style this a bit more, put in some space. So going to the wrapper for the cards, right? What I can do is, I guess, just put margin bottom here. Margin bottom, let's say 5m. Like this is our second heading. Margin bottom is this. I'm adding a 5m's margin here, right? And what we need to work on right now is the overlay, right? Because like the overlay does not seem to be working. We have a dashboard, we have an API, we have this. And because we can remove this path, let the spacing, overlay, where's the overlay? Right, this is basically RGBA, right? Background color. This is kind of it. It does not seem to be working. Because like whenever you use RGB values, you get a color picker like this. So I think I made some mistake while using it. Okay, it should work now. It was a comma kind of term. So like as you can see, we have our overlay here now basically. I will turn off this flex, right? You can see we have our overlay. We need some padding around the margin, either the nav bar, because it's kind of tightly packed. So let's go to the nav bar. Let's do a padding of 2m. 2m is a bit too much. 0 left and right 2m. Right, this seems to be working. Yes. And we need to apply it on the placeholder. Placeholder actually had a container around it. So where's the placeholder? Hero text. This is a placeholder, some random information. Yes. Hero image holder. So let's do this. Hero image holder, right? And for its size, we have a minimum height. Minimum height is a property that basically does not allow an element to go smaller than the specified size. width is going to be 500 pixel. It will not exceed it, but it can get smaller than that. Let's have a display flex because we want to align this placeholder inside of it. Justify content, center, then align items center. Basically aligns it perfectly like this, right? And we also need to apply border radius to these cards, right? So let's go to the cards. These are the cards. Let's have a border radius of 12 pixel. Looks like I made some mistake again. It's not on the cards, it's on the square. Border radius 12 pixel. So basically curved it. It's still a square, but it's curved, right? Now sign up. We need a white sign up button. So like let's make a class for that. I think we made a class. It's button white. So let's do button white, right? And let's start with the color of the text. Color is going to be var secondary. Font size is again going to be, let's say, 20 pixels. Border radius 20 pixels. Padding 0.5 m to m, 0.5 m to m. Font with bold, and have a border, white border. So like the first property is the color, it's white, then how wide it is, then the type. I want solid, so basically color, width, and the type of border. And the background color is basically RGBA 255 255 255 0.05. Right. It seemed like there was a problem with the auto reloader. Like this is a like basic layout setup, right? So like I don't think we have enough time to go on the dashboard part. So like we will jump over to the API, like because like JavaScript is kind of important, because like this is just the basic front end. Like I can't really do anything with it. JavaScript is important. So like let's get working on the API part, right? So like this API.html, let's set up the boilerplate, call it API, right? Then this href that we had earlier in index.html is going to point to this. So when I open this, it brings me here, right? It's going to link the same style sheet, /style.css, right? I'm going to take some code from here. I just need the boilerplate for the header, right? It's gonna have the same header, right? Same header. And what we going to have right now is like a search bar where the user can put in things, right? And query, then click on the search button, then get some songs. That's like basically the API that's doing the work. So before that, let's include our script. So like it's the script tag, right? Put in script tag source, and the source is going to be index.js. And what you need to do is put in the differ keyword if you're putting it in the head, because if your HTML page is big or it arrives later on, the JavaScript will load first, and if you are trying to access some elements, it will throw up some errors because the HTML page has not arrived yet. So defer keyword basically stops the loading of JavaScript until and unless the HTML page has loaded up first. So coming on to the JavaScript part, right? Like, let's start putting on some elements that we can target later on, right? So what we have is pretty simple. We have, let's say, a div, a class, right? Div dot about, and what it's going to have is basically this part. It's basically what this page is about. It's going to be inside the p tag. Put it there, right? And put a break line tag there. I'm just gonna go get the basic thing set up and working. Then I have a wrapper for like this type of search bar. So with the search bar, like a wrapper first. Then I have an input type text, right? Then I have a button, and this is basically the same button. So like, here's the way the concept of utility classes come. I'm just using the button and it's going to apply the property here. I don't need to like care much about defining those properties again. I'm gonna apply the search button again. It's going to allow me to select things later on. Now I have a main with ID, right? I will just call it result, right? Class of container, right? So this is like a basic HTML setup, right? We had a button here, search, right? This is our basic HTML setup. There seems to be some problem with the live server reloading. So like, you can't really see the styles. It should not be happening, but let's work with what we have. So let's start applying styles to it. And like, I am going to use two styles sheets for this one. One is styles, right? Then another one is going to be the API slash CSS, right? So this is the HTML, this is the CSS. So like, herein I will just put in some code really fast so I can show you like how the JavaScript part works. Like, I will just bring it from here because like, we are on a time crunch right now. This is the CSS query field, document.query selector, input type text, right? And I need the card container. We are basically like right now selecting all the elements that we are going to access later on. And just to make sure we have like selected the right things, just console.log search button. It will basically output the elements and the query field, right? If I check it here in the console, right? So as you can see, it's like output is this. I've selected this button is the search button. This is the input button, the query field actually, right? And in JavaScript we work with event listeners, like basically it has happened. So like add event listener, it's a function. What we are listening for is the click, when someone clicks on it, and it takes a callback function, which is basically what it needs to do when someone clicks it. So like it will call the handle click function, right? And we need to define the handle click function. We have not defined that yet. So we will just go up the code, define the function. Handle click E. E is an implicit parameter for the event, right? So E dot prevent default. Each event has some default values, default action associated with it. That usually happens when we click a button. It usually causes a page refresh. We don't want that, so we are using this, right? Console.log query field dot value, basically just to see what the value the user has inputted. We will use this later on. It's just for showing you guys on the console. Then I have some API information. It's from Rapid API, right? I will just go and copy it from here. So let's see. And I need a function, like let's do this part first. Let's do Eminem, right? Open this. I click on search. Says query field is not defined. So I guess I used the wrong. The F is capital. We'll just wait for this to load up. Let's do this. We are getting this, right? Is my internet working? ओए किटी जरा नेट खोलेगा अपना
खोल दिया
I hope you guys can see my screen again. My internet died for a bit. It's like I was on the last part regarding the JavaScript section, right? Like calling the API and stuff. So like I will go right back to it. So basically, I hope you guys can see my screen again. My what's happening is when I click on search, right, it's supposed to issue a API call, right, and might take some time depending on my internet connection. It takes quite a bit because VIT internet is slow as usual. I get the data. It's in the form of like in the object inside data, right? Here's my index.js. I issued a call, waited for the response. It's an async operation, so I'm waiting for it basically. When it's done, I remove all the cards if I'm searching again, right? If this is the first or not, like then I access the data attribute inside this response object, which contains information about all the songs and tracks. I call the create card function with respect to each index. So basically I'm passing this object to this create card function, and this function takes this input and accesses its attributes, this object's attributes, and assigns it to HTML elements. Now how do we do that? The JavaScript is able to interact with the browser's API, which allows us to modify the HTML document, right? So I have a card object, like a card variable I use the create element function, which allows me to basically create an element with respect to like what I'm passing a div here. If you want to see it in an inspector, right, this is what it is. This, I have a card. Inside the card I have a div and I have image, right? And this is going to be a card, right? So this is my card with div. I'm adding a class. Classlist.add is another function which adds a class to an element. That element right now resides in card basically. So I'm adding the card class to this div element. You can see it here. Then I am creating an image tag, create element image img, assigning some properties to it. It's same as accessing the object values in JavaScript, right? So like image dot style is the CSS property. Then inside that there's another CSS property called width. Then that's 100%. I'm basically passing all my CSS values as strings to this function, to these attributes. And once I'm done with this, I will basically call the append child function, which will basically append this image element to another element with respect to which I'm calling it. In this case, it is the card. So append child works basically like appending any element in an array or list. I think you guys would be familiar with it with regards to pushing elements in a list. So I am pushing image at the last index, basically is inside this card, right? That is what happening under the hood. Image gets pushed in this the card, right? Then same thing happens with the h3 tag. It gets pushed after the image because it's append. Same with artist and same with the audio control things, right? And once I have my card element ready, I basically return out of the function into a variable, and I add this card to a card container the same way I added elements to the card, right? So it's basically again card container, the item with respect to we are calling it dot append child, the item that we want to append, that is basically the card. So when this function basically runs for each element, this is the type of output you will get, right? And let's say if I search Eminem, right, I get the remove card function first of all executes, which removes all the cards from here, then again puts new cards in its place. That's all guys, thank you.